So we are going through the life of Christ chronologically, so a little bit different. But one of the questions that was asked last week, and forgive me, I cannot remember who asked it. Might have been you, maybe it was Sharon, or maybe someone else. But the question was kind of, as a Greek, why do I hate Jews? If maybe you remember that question. It's taking me a little bit more longer to get the answer than I expected. I expected to have an answer to that question as a Greek, because we're talking here in the first century as a Greek, why do I hate Jews? I thought I'd have an answer this week. It's taking a little bit longer, and the reason why is because in 2015, the Anti-Defamation League, they conducted a study in Europe, and they polled 10,000 Greeks, so people in Greece, 10,000 people. And they found that 67 to 69% hated Jews, and Greece is actually classified as the most anti-Semitic country in Europe. So I say that not to harp on people of Greece, because I love their food, but mainly because all of the research that I'm trying to go through to figure out, to get to the first century reason, and before that, it's taken a little bit longer because I'm having to weed through all of the 2015 up until 2022 data. So hopefully I'll have something next week for that. So I don't know why it is. I don't know why it's classified as the most anti-Semitic. I don't know why 67 to 69% of the population in Greece do not like Jews. But hopefully I'll get the information and we'll at least find an origin somewhere. Okay, so we are looking at Christ. Last week we read through those genealogies, and we discussed somewhat as to their importance and how the differences there, how one goes back to Abraham and how another goes all the way back to God, and one goes in reverse order and one goes forward, and how the importance of that because of the records that they would keep. We talked about them charting everyone's genealogy, especially the men they paid closer attention to, bless you, God bless you. But also the fact that in AD 70, with the destruction of Jerusalem, all of those genealogies get destroyed. And so no one can say, well, I'm a Levite, I should be a priest, or I'm next in line to be a priest, or what have you, because there are no records to confirm that. That is one reason why Christ, he is not only our high priest, but he is a high priest forever. See, before is you would have a high priest and he would serve, and when he died, the next person in line would take that spot, and they could trace that based upon the genealogies. Well, with Jerusalem destroyed and we have Christ, who is our high priest, he died, and so normally a high priest dies, someone else takes their spot, but he was resurrected. So there is no one to come after him. There is no record for anyone to even say, well, no, really, it should be me. No one can lay claim to that. So we were looking at several things there and wanted to look also somewhat at his birth. Then we're going to get into really the beginning of his ministry. We don't have a lot regarding Christ's childhood. We only have the one incident of him being about 12 years old, and he's at the temple with his parents. And remember, they start traveling back, and it's a couple of days before they realize that he's gone. Now, this is not the case if we just have this family of 6 or 7 that are traveling together. I mean, there are hundreds, if not thousands, traveling in this line. But it's a couple of days and they go back and find him in the temple. That's the only example that we have of his childhood. Now, there is an extra biblical text that is the Gospel according to Thomas, which has the birth narrative in it. It has been found to contain contradictions, if not within itself, but in comparing it to Scripture. That's one of the reasons why it's not included in the Bible. When there is a standard, when people were going through and determining what would be canonized, what would be included in Scripture in these 66 books that we have, there was criteria that had to be met. And so that way, anything that came up, if it didn't meet that criteria, it was out. There's the Gospel according to Judas, for example. I find that very interesting since Judas committed suicide. So I'm not really sure how he writes that after the fact. Maybe the Old Testament, remember the fingers writing on the walls there? I don't know. But the last thing really that I wanted to look at was Christ's birth. If you want to go ahead and turn over to Matthew, we'll look at chapter 2 because we're not looking at the entire account of his birth, but something that we need to point out. Really, we've got the announcement of his birth, Mary visiting Elizabeth, John, the immerser's birth, angel appearing to Joseph, birth of Christ, angel announcing, and all of this. There's just one particular thing that I wanted us to consider here. And the reason that we're looking specifically at the life of Christ, one, because he is our Savior, he is our high priest, he is the perfect sacrifice. You know, Isaiah 53, by his stripes we are healed. He is the wellspring of life. But because the image that the world has of Christ is not necessarily the biblical image. And so what we're trying to do is to understand the biblical image a little bit more, and you'll see what I mean. What do you normally see around Christmas time? Okay, nativity scene, the manger, right? Now I'm talking religious stuff. I'm not talking about the Santa pictures and, the big presents people put in their yard or, anything like that. The primary thing religious-wise is the nativity scene, right? Angels, right? And so, I'm sorry? The wise men, right? So we've got the nativity scene, we have the magi, the wise men, the angels, and what have you. So I just want us to look here in Matthew chapter 2. So I'll just start reading there in verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. And when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he was inquiring of them where the Christ was to be born. And they said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is but what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, and by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a leader, who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod secretly called the Magi and carefully determined from them the time the star appeared, and he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search carefully for the child. And when you have found him, report to me, so that I too may come and worship him. And so now after that, after hearing the king, verse 9, they went their way, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east was going on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And after coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell onto the ground and worshipped him. Them opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And we'll just go ahead and stop right there. So the first thing that we notice is we have the worldview of the birth of Christ, and generally presented around Christmas time with the nativity scene and what have you. And in the nativity scene, you have the manger. You've got Mary on one side, Joseph on the other. You've got the little shepherd boy with the sheep, and you've got the magi there, either holding their gifts or on their their camels, and maybe it's even one of those that has the spot where you can hang the angel on the nail, that's above where the rafters meet there. But even just starting this off, it starts off now after Jesus was born. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. They didn't even arrive in Bethlehem. They arrived in Jerusalem. Now, I understand that with the picture of the nativity, people might be using that as an image to capture the entire view of Christ's birth, of everything that happened. On the one hand, that's great and I understand it, but at the same time, it does not necessarily picture everything, and it doesn't picture everything accurately. So we have that Christ has already been born. The Magi aren't there. There could have been a shepherd. Who knows? But they're there. Christ is born. They're in Jerusalem. Some time has passed. Not only for them to get to Jerusalem, but remember Herod, he calls the chief priests, he calls the scribes, and then they have to get together and confer and make sure everyone's on the same page. It's kind of like watching Congress on C-SPAN, waiting for Democrats and Republicans to all agree. It's not a quick thing necessarily. So they come together, and finally there's a consensus, I guess majority rules on that he was going to be born in Bethlehem. Notice also that there is no specific day that he's given. Part of the reason for that is because God only wanted one day to be counted as sacred. And that was the day that he set apart, that was the Sabbath in the Old Testament, and then this first day of the week in the New Testament. But then we skip down a little bit in verse 11, and after having come into where did they come into? They came into a house. They came into a house. They didn't come into a barn. They didn't come into a manger. They didn't come into a hut or anything. The word there is house, meaning a dwelling place, which would have been a different place than where animals are kept. So we look at the nativity scene and we see, the manger there, and he's wrapped in swaddling clothes, and they're there, and animals around, and hay bales, and all of this. That's not the case. This would have been a home. It would have been a very small home, more than likely just one room. They were very poor. Joseph and Mary were, not only having to flee because of Herod, but the fact that when they went to the temple, they presented pigeons. And if we look at the opening chapters of Leviticus, there are 3 different types of sacrifices that people can make based on their financial standing. If you're a wealthier, it's kind of like this. If you're a wealthy person today and you want to go out to eat, you might go somewhere like Meg or Keg or whatever and get you a tomahawk steak, loaded baked potato. By the way, I've had that. It's very good. Loaded baked potato, a glass of iced tea or something, If you're not so well off, and we're not well off, that was an anniversary thing. I don't want people getting the wrong opinion. But anyhow, if you're not so financially there, I'm going to go out to eat, and I'm going to McDonald's, and you're only allowed to look at the dollar menu, okay? That's kind of how it was. The Old Testament, there's these different tiers, and so they offered pigeons. So the house that they would have been in, it would have been a home. It would have been a dwelling place. There would have been some type of bed. If not, most of them had mats. You think of the leper with his mat or what have you. And that's where they show up. Now, look over in verse 13. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him." And now we skip down to verse 16. Then Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi. He became very estranged and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had carefully determined from the Magi. There's a good deal of time that has passed. Christ is born. After Christ is already born, the Magi, they come from the east. Now, if they had already started on their journey, we don't know. We know that they saw the star, they were led, they end up in Jerusalem. Scribes, Pharisees, priests, they come together and they determine, okay, out of Bethlehem. So the Magi then go to Bethlehem. By this time, Mary and Joseph, they're not in a manger, they're back at home, or they're in a home, okay? The Magi come in, and then Joseph receives a dream. That dream, go to Egypt. It's fulfilling a prophecy that we see there in verses 14 and 15. Out of Egypt I will call my son. So you're fleeing to Egypt. God is going to give them time to get there, right? And then Herod realizes that he's been tricked, and he orders the murder of all males under 4 months? 2 months? Yeah, 2 years. So the narrative that we see around the holidays, and I say this not to damper anybody's Christmas or anything like that, but it's so that we as God's people do not have a misconception of biblical events. That's the reason. Because one misconception leads to another. Because when people, they separate God, for example, and they say, I don't want the Old Testament God, I want the New Testament God, who's nice, warm, fuzzy, forgiving, and all of this. I don't want the wrath of God. I just want the mercy. And so we as God's people need to be able to kind of discern these things. Use your own discernment in how you use the knowledge specifically regarding this. It's probably not a very nice thing, not a very Christian thing, to walk around your neighborhood looking for nativity scenes and then knocking on the doors and trying to correct people. Probably don't want to do that. So anyhow, we're looking at 2 years and under, so a great deal of time has passed. Now, even beyond that 2 years, just looking at it was after the birth and the fact that they came into a house, and that Christ is referred to as a child. Not an infant, he is a child. Now, he would be considered a child after being circumcised, which would be the 8th day, according to Old Testament law there in Leviticus 12 and verse 3. So we're looking at least 8 days there. And any thoughts or comments so far? Okay. Oh, yes, ma'am. Yes. Right, that part's accurate. The part about not being in any room in the inn and what have you, that part is accurate. And there could have been a shepherd boy there. It's highly doubtful. And the reason that I say that is because, one, sheep, they're not kept at that time in barns. And we know this from later in the scriptures, how Christ describes the sheep and being kept in a pen and what have you. There's nothing that says a star appeared to a shepherd boy or what have you. But what we do know is that there could have been more people there, certainly. We know that they were poor, so she wasn't affording a midwife. We know that they were traveling, so they didn't have a lot of goods with them. They didn't have any money, There was no room for them at the end, but that part's accurate. The other stuff, not so much. Good question. Any other questions? Okay. As a side note, because some people might say, well, why, just following up on this, they might say, well, then why do we celebrate Christmas on December 25th, right? Fair question. The first recorded Christmas celebration was actually December 25th, 336 AD. So you're looking at 300 years, a little over 300 years after the birth of Christ. It was not a first century celebration at all. And it was actually the Romans who invented it because what they associated Christ, remember Romans, they had all of their different gods, little g, right, and idols. Idols, same thing for them. And they associated Christ with the sun in the sky because people kept calling him the Son of Righteousness. And December 25th is the winter solstice, when the sun is in the sky the longest, and so they associated that with him. But it wasn't until 336 AD that we have the first Christmas celebration. It's interesting, too, because Puritans, during the time of Elizabeth, Mary Tudor, or Bloody Mary as she better known, and even in the United States, in New England, Puritans banned the celebration of Christmas because it was an invention of Catholicism. It's kind of interesting. Anyhow, most people tend to think, and we're not going to go into it here, most people, did you? Oh, okay. Most people tend to believe that Jesus was actually born in the springtime, partially because spring, new birth, rebirth, after winter and everything's died and what have you. But also the fact that a shepherd would not have been out, even in the Middle East, in the middle of the desert or what have you, with their sheep during wintertime. Because even though it's very hot during the day, it gets very cold at night. So it would have been made more sense to be out in the springtime. But we can probably look at that at a later time. Yes, ma'am. Sure. For me personally, I believe it's a personal choice. When we celebrate Christmas, for example, when my family does, we're not celebrating it as this is Jesus' birthday. My mom, who is still very much Southern Baptist, she is also very much this is Jesus' birthday, that type of thing. And we see it everywhere, people, happy birthday, Jesus, or what have you. When we celebrate, it's a time of family, it's a time of love and sharing each other. It's a time of thankfulness for the kids. It's a time of gimme, 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 that type of thing. I think that celebrating family and being thankful for the year, and I personally don't see anything scripturally wrong with that. I do see something wrong if we're celebrating it as the birth of Christ, because then we're marking a day to be special, and the only day that God set apart to be sacred, to be special, was, again, the Sabbath for the Old Testament, the first day of the week, why we refer to it as the Lord's Day. There are some, there is an Old Testament, I can't remember if it's Jeremiah. There are some who are against it because in one of the Old Testament prophets, maybe Rachel, you can Google it real quick, but it talks about a Christmas tree. It doesn't call it a Christmas tree, but it talks about people going out into the woods, cutting down a tree, adorning it with gold, and getting down on their knees and receiving gifts or offerings from under it. And so some people will say, that's a Christmas tree. It's like, no, that's a whole other context as well. Really celebrating Christmas, a personal decision, and there's arguments over all things. Should we celebrate Easter? Should we celebrate this? There's the reason behind it. Did you look? 10:3. Okay. Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 3. If you're curious about that, and we'll flip over there real quick. We've got time. I thought it was Jeremiah. I thought he had a bullfrog. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Jeremiah 10. I'll just start in verse 1. Jeremiah 10. Hear the word which Yahweh speaks to you, O house of Israel. Thus says Yahweh, do not learn the way of the nations, and do not be terrified by the signs of the heavens, although the nations are terrified by them. For the statutes of the people are vanity, because it is wood cut from the forest, the work of the hands of a craftsman with a cutting tool. They make it beautiful with silver and gold. They strengthen it with nails and with hammers, so that it will not totter. Like a scarecrow in a cucumber field are they, and they can't speak. They must be carried. They can't do this. So it's talking about going out, cutting this tree and adorning it and what have you. And really what that's talking about is fashioning idols. So some people will try to use that and say, no, it's talking about Christmas trees. No, it's not. It's talking about fashioning idols. It even says, don't be like the nations and what have you. Yes, sir.
In Matthew's account, Jesus is spoken of as King of the Jews. But in the Old Testament prophecies, there's nothing, it's not called King of the Jews.
Right.
So how did that come about?
We're talking about his birth, and you are way up there at the crucifixion. Well, no. It's
from his birth to his death, he was King of the Jews, spoken of that way.
Right.
But it wasn't prophesied that way. God didn't say that.
Right, because the Old Testament referred to, as the Messiah, or with Moses, there was the prophet. We talked about that before, I think 2.5 years ago when we started the book of John on Wednesdays nights. So yeah, he had many different titles for it, but yeah, King of the Jews was not one of them. Most tend to feel that the reason that there's not the reference of the King of the Jews in the Old Testament as it is in the New Testament is because of the way that kings were brought about in the Old Testament. You think about it, Israel didn't have a king until they started disobeying God, and they wanted to be like everybody else. And they start saying, give us a king, give us a king. And so they get King Saul. Kind of good, kind of bad, depending on that point in his life, right? And you've got bad kings, and you've got good kings, and what have you. And so there's no permanency there. It would be, okay, this king's gone, who's the next king going to take his place? But then, those 430 intertestamental years, it allows somewhat of a theological cleansing of the people to get rid of those ideas. There hasn't been a king there for, those 400 plus years. They've been ruled by either Babylon or the Greeks or the Romans or the Chaldeans, or pick a tribe, any tribe. So yeah, but we will go into it more.
But it's not a God-given term. That's
Right.
what I wanted to hear. Because I can't find it.
Right. It's God-given in the sense that we see it in the New Testament through the writings of inspired men, but not necessarily as a label, if that makes sense. Any other questions so far? Okay. I hope I didn't dash anybody's Christmas spirits, but according to my calendar, you have plenty of time to get those spirits back. Again, we're looking at this because of seeing what does the Bible say versus what does the world say. And we have to start where all things start, at the beginning. Now, we already went through John, so we're not doing that again. So we'll start at the beginning with his birth, and we've kind of made our way through that. So then I want us to go ahead and skip forward, actually, because the only account that we have of his youth is just that one time in the temple. So there's not really a whole lot there other than the sense of you have parents who didn't find him for a couple of days because there are thousands traveling in this caravan. They go back, they look over him, around for him, find him in the temple where he is not only teaching, but he's listening and what have you. And that he goes back, and it says that he grew in wisdom and in stature. That wisdom and in stature, him being 12 years old, there's argument to be made there. Some people believe that Christ did not know everything, partially because of his age, partially because of because he was, according to the New Testament writers, in always human and tempted like we are, but without sin. And so you think a 12-year-old boy, we're sure that he heard the stories, that he was the Son of God. How all of that worked out, we have no idea. But I do believe that it is certainly possible that while he was here on earth, he did not know everything. And the reason that I say that is because in his ministry, he said, for example, on him returning back, that no man knows the day nor the hour, not even the Son. And being God, he can limit his own knowledge. He can do whatever he wants to do. We can't fathom that, and that's got to do with whole fourth and fifth dimensional thinking, which is a whole other lesson for a whole other time. But so what type of wisdom he grew in, we don't know. We do know the Old Testament, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So it's complicated. So we're just going to, that is a whole series of itself. Yes, sir.
You told us last week to think like we're in the first century.
As best as we can, yes, sir.
Well, I believe that a 12-year-old, and I won't call it a child because I think at 12 years old, he was about to be a man.
Mm-hmm.
In their terms, 12 years old was pretty grown up back then.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's it's the bar mitzvah, like bar mitzvahs, they didn't come until later, even. And there is some argument. Yeah, a lot of people believe that around that age that they, are entering into manhood. Some people believe that it's at 20 years old. It all depends. And 20 years old was because that's when the old Hebrew people, the men would go into military service. Timothy, for example, called a young man or whatever, and he's, most people think, in his mid-40s, like more around my age, which shows how little I have accomplished in my life. But yes, sir.
The point I wanted to make is that I've always felt that he wasn't watched like a child would be, an infant.
Sure.
So maybe you didn't need to know where it was for 2 days.
Sure. No, absolutely. And I mean, the world has drastically changed since, the first century. Yes, there were still dangers and what have you, but maybe right. I tell you what, we'll go ahead and end the class a couple of minutes early because we're going to get into the beginning of Christ's ministry, and I don't want us to get started there and then just kind of, have to stop in the middle of something. So we'll pick up with the beginning of his ministry next week. And so what you probably want to look at or read, I would say all of Matthew chapter 3, and then chapter 4, verses 1 through 17. And that'll take you the preaching of John, the baptism of Christ, and up through the temptations of Christ. So Matthew chapter 3, then chapter 4, 1 through 17. Yes, ma'am. Sure. That's from Isaiah chapter 53, the suffering servant. And when the Jew, and it's a prophecy of Christ and him being flogged and what have you prior to the crucifixion, when he was getting the whips with our equivalent of glass and a type of iron and bone and everything in it. But in Isaiah 53, it says that the people had the idea that Jesus was being whipped and punished because of something that he had done. And so when it's then talking about by his stripes we are healed, it's talking really about the entire picture of the crucifixion of, the trials, if we can call them that he went through, him being flogged, the crucifixion, by his stripes, by the punishment that he took. That's how we are healed. It also plays a part later in the New Testament where we find that the blood of bulls and goats, it can't forgive sins. That goes to the Old Testament. Life is in the blood. Goes to Passover and them having to cover their doorposts with the blood of the lamb so that death passed over, and so we're covered by the blood of the lamb. It's spiritually. So it's referencing that those who come to Christ, who are baptized for the forgiveness of their sins, Acts 2:38, 1 Peter 3:21, that they are then added by the Lord to his church. And that we are covered with the blood of Christ. His blood heals us, not physically, but spiritually. Good questions. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Well, like I said, Matthew chapter 3 and then chapter 4, 1 through 17, just to familiarize yourself with it. Then we'll get in there with Jesus' ministry.